Welcome to Expert Conversations Unpacked, where Chatham's experts break down important trends and themes for capital markets professionals. I'm John Skeem, and I'm Managing Director focused on capital markets advisory here at Chatham.
I'm Becky, Chatham's Chief People Officer, and this is our very first episode, so thank you for joining us.
Recently, Chatham CEO Matt Henry interviewed NYU professor Suzy Welch. They covered a variety of topics ranging from authenticity in the workplace to mentorship to how to retain talent and minimize employee turnover. For those listeners who haven't had a chance to watch the video yet, you can find it linked in the show notes on Chatham's YouTube channel or Chatham's website, which is chathamfinancial.com. So Becky, I want to delve into that conversation with you a little bit more today. Suzy talks about making friends instead of networking. She also talks about the younger generation's aversion to crossing that personal line in a professional atmosphere. How does Gen Z keep these parts of their lives separated while also succeeding in their careers? And is that possible, especially when you consider the importance of building an authentic workplace?
I do think the role of an authentic workplace becomes more and more critical as time progresses, and a super interesting topic to explore. Maybe not unique to Gen Z, but I do respect the fact that they're looking for that type of separation. I just feel like that separation doesn't necessarily mean that they're not showing up as their authentic self in both places, both in their personal life as well as in their professional life. Suzy makes a comment in her talk with Matt, like she references like all the tiles in a mosaic of all the people that are in your life and how it creates this beautiful mosaic. And I often, think about your life as a stadium. And if you, think about your life as a stadium and you're on stage, and you're looking at all of the people in the stadium of your life. And there are people tailgating in the parking lot. There are people getting snacks. There are people that paid extra for front row. There are people in your mosh pit. And I think knowing and understanding where people sit in your life and what they mean to you and being comfortable with that is okay and is healthy. And when I hear that, like that comment about Gen Z trying to keep it separate, I read it a little bit differently or process that a little bit differently and think of it more in the context of where are they putting their work relationships versus their personal relationships. In any stadium, some views are obstructed. So maybe they're thinking about that as just really having clarity around where everyone sits. And, some people can see or hear better than others. So to me, that feels like they're trying to control that environment for themselves differently. And again, I have a lot of respect for that. I feel that the component of authenticity is really important. I worked really hard and had an acknowledgement early in my career. I realized I wasn't really being my whole self at work. I started, early career in consulting. Felt like I had to kind of live up to what I viewed at that time in my career as, what a consultant was supposed to look like and the pedigree you were supposed to have, and kind of tried to stay true to who that was. And I was, even as I applied for that role, I was known as Rebecca at the time. So for 8 years, people referred to me as Rebecca. Nobody called me Rebecca in my life, except for like my dad when he was upset with me. So when I was switching roles, I had a epiphany moment. Like I wanted to make sure my email address was Becky. And it was really small, but at that time, it was the start of my own journey to understanding how to bring my whole self to work. And I think that is ultimately what an authentic workplace is. And I feel like people end up attracted to organizations that align with their personal values. Suzy talks a lot about that as well, which I thought was fascinating. If you know what your personal values are, authentically, you're living out your life if you're aligned with them. Well, hopefully people are finding organizations and people within those organizations that they feel like they can connect to. And I think that that's, just a really important component of it. There's a piece of that, though, that's, about where people sit in your life, but there's also the balance of work and personal. So Suzy discussed Gen Z's tendencies to maintain that separation between work and personal life. And she feels that building those personal relationships at work, have obviously those great benefits. Do you think that the distance affects this generation's ability to build meaningful workplace connections? Like, how do you feel about them balancing those personal boundaries and still shaping those important personal relationships at work?
Yeah, I think it's still really early, in my opinion, for Gen Z, and I don't want to pick on them too much because I think it might just be more of they've had less time in the workplace, generally speaking. And coming out of COVID, there were a whole bunch of folks that really had to focus on work-life balance and putting up boundaries in work that historically hadn't been there. So some of it is more personality driven, some of it's experience driven, and I'm really interested to see how that plays out with Gen Z over time. In general, though, I think everybody needs to find their own way when it comes to figuring out what the work-life balance is and the relationships they want to make in either place. I really like your stadium analogy. I think how you fill that stadium, whether it's folks at work or folks at home, folks you met at school, I think it's a really, really good insight. And I think everybody's different and everybody should be their natural selves. I think you're going to be a lot happier whether you're at work or at home if you're being your natural self. So fully on board with that. So Becky, in your experience with talent acquisition and retention, how do the best companies and cultures think about setting up mentorship programs? Can you share an example of how mentorship has impacted your life, whether it be personal or professional?
I mean, I think there's a couple different ways to think about mentorship. And sure, like, some of the biggest organizations think of them more on a programmatic level, but ultimately what they're trying to do is create opportunities for people to connect and hopefully create some sort of meaningful relationship. Sometimes the challenge with that is it can be forced. So when it's not as natural, sometimes it might not have as meaningful of an impact on the individual. Certainly can help people set themselves up within the organization that they work and operate. And these programs can be really important. Again, calling back from my days in consulting, joining a huge organization, there were mentorship circles. You had opportunities to meet and get exposed to senior leaders, which, as a younger professional was really important. One, to kind of humanize them for, kind of where you were in your career at that point. But then also in these mentoring circles, create opportunities to establish relationships as well with peers in that same context. Some programs, mentorship programs, are really focused more on leadership development and potential and trying to align future potential leaders with leaders in the organization that have really excelled. And sometimes some of those lessons learned can be fantastic, and you'll take away from that what you put into it. But it's something that's, set up for you as opposed to something that you naturally create. And I do think that they're really important, particularly in larger organizations when you need to make smaller circles for yourself and in that hopefully establish more meaningful relationships. But I also think some cultures or that organizations try to support, they just try to create norms of behavior that naturally lend themselves to what mentorship could look like. So people constantly willing to offer time, lend a helping hand, answer a question, make themselves available, open door policy. Some of that is about leadership behaviors, about style, about, curiosity within an organization and kind of creating some of that openness through, your values, your principles, whatever that might be and however it might be. Early in career, you think of mentorship like I'm supposed to find like the mentor of my life. But in my experience, there really was no silver bullet. I think at each life stage that you enter, your needs and where you're looking to grow and evolve from next are constantly changing. I always kind of think of it, I can't remember who to give credit to for this, but someone had shared this with me once. If you think of it at any point in your life, what would you want your board of directors to be based on what you're trying to accomplish, based on what you're struggling with, based on what you need to learn from, understand, grow from? So if you think about what that board of directors might look like at any given time. At one point in my life, I was a new working mom with a really demanding schedule. I was new to a career position or new to leadership. So whatever that might look like, I just feel like mentorship is and could be constantly evolving and changing with people swapping seats in terms of your board of directors over time. And I've had people all along that path. I wouldn't say there is one because, again, like I said, I don't feel like there's a silver bullet at very different, meaningful, and pivotal points. I've had people to turn to that I've sought out. And usually it's been individuals that I either admire or look at as individuals that are doing really well where I feel like I'm struggling. And I think part of it is kind of having that vulnerability to know where you need to ask for and seek for that help. And, defining that as mentorship in that way, I think is where it's probably had the most impact for me. John, you're a leader of a diverse team, spans multiple generations. I would imagine that mentorship and modeling good habits are really important parts of achieving successful outcomes for you, for the team. What are your thoughts on mentorship?
Yeah, I think everything that you said really resonates with me. I've had the benefit of working for small organizations, or it's a benefit to me. I really enjoy working in small organizations where everything has been a little bit more organic. And so Suzy talked about seeking out friendships without like necessarily looking for additional benefits or like what could launch you to the next step in your career necessarily, just building authentic relationships. In these smaller organizations, as I've grown up over time, I've had the benefit of like having authentic relationships with folks that really knew a lot more than I did. They could have been peers. They could have been people more senior to me in the organization. They could have been people more junior to me in the organization. But in all cases, the common thread is that authentic relationship, the building of trust between people and just working together towards a common goal. I think a lot of mentorship actually comes naturally from that. And the one experience I had at a very large corporation, I didn't love. There were those formal programs. So I think part of this to me depends on the person as well. There are probably some people that really thrive in those larger organizations that like to have those set programs and actually can map things out over time and want to have that visibility for where they can map those mentor relationships. Everything for me has been a little bit more organic and it's felt a lot more natural. And our business here in particular is built kind of in a mentorship and apprenticeship model. And as a small organization that's grown over time, that's worked out really well for us. The relationships are solid. There's a solid team of people with a common goal, playing to each other's strengths, knowing each other's weaknesses, and having that thread of mentorship across those teams, I think has helped us serve our clients better. I don't know if does that address your question?
It does, and it makes me wonder about the role of mentorship and at what point you turn and start to shift and provide that mentorship to others. Is there a point in your career where you acknowledge that for yourself in any way that other listeners might think about that? Because a lot of times it's more directed to who should be your mentor, but also when should you become a mentor?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a pay it forward element to it. It depends a little bit on the person, probably. They need to recognize how much they benefited from mentorship and realize they have more to give. I think there's things that companies can do to help facilitate that, maybe not necessarily with big formal programs, but I think when you hit on focusing on qualities of leaders that will turn around and do that for people that are coming up in the organization behind them and invest in their teams, like that makes a true leader in my mind, as opposed to just staffing a bunch of levels with managers. So you want to emphasize the right qualities within your organization so that you're actually incentivizing people to pay it
hmm
forward.
I think that's when it becomes kind of ingrained in a culture, and it's part of the expectation of what high performance looks like is when, people are seen for also kind of giving back. To your point, it doesn't always have to be the formal program, it's more just how you engage.
How do you think we should be thinking about failure and being fired? There's such a stigma around being fired, it seems to force people to take less risks. Some of the most successful people in business point back to times when they were terminated as pivotal moments in their careers. How should we as business leaders be talking about risk taking to our employees?
It's such an interesting topic. Oftentimes in organizations, when they're talking about bringing more agility into their organizations, they talk about having to fail fast and fail fast as an organization. So, creating psychologically, like that psychological safety. So the environments where people feel like they can do that. When I think about that concept in the construct of an individual and an individual's failure, I feel like as individuals, we have to be ready to also fail fast. It's hard, even for myself. I've been on both sides of the table, having to share news with individuals that, are going to be moving on or having that message shared with me. And so you have to feel all the feels. There's ego involved. You're going to kind of you have to go down like the rabbit hole you need to go down to work through all of that. But at the end of the day, having the ability to pivot. We talk about it even in our people strategy at Chatham, like having organizational agility and, it's like readiness for change, ready to pivot at whatever opportunity might come your way. So if anyone is faced with like a decision made where they're not the ones making that decision, I think mentally just being ready to pivot and knowing that there are going to be more opportunities to learn and grow from. I think sometimes, and I really do inherently believe this, if an organization is making a decision like that, it's inherently and for the long term good for the individual and good for the organization. It means there's something better. It means the organization is going to evolve in a different way that might not be right for the individual. So it's very symbiotic that way. It doesn't feel it in the moment, but as you move past it, I really think that there's an opportunity to be more accepting of failure, knowing that it is such a critical component of growth. It's super uncomfortable. And I think oftentimes, people don't want to feel uncomfortable. They get in a groove, they get in a flow. But honestly, if I look back at my own career and think of the different points and times where I've been the most uncomfortable for whatever reason it might be, starting a new job, a challenge, moving on for some reason, those are the moments where I've learned and grown the most personally and professionally. So I feel like there's opportunities for us as individuals to think about it differently, as well as organizations to support it and have our conversations about it differently as well. One other thing to consider too is that business is constantly changing. And I think as you consider what pivoting might look like for you, knowing that you have to be willing to let go of your personal conventions as well as the conventions of the organizations that you work with, because it can't stay the same forever. So I think sometimes people think of some of those shifts as, it's hard to let go. It feels like a failure if they can't hang on. I think having that ability and that willingness to let go and, kind of see the forest for the trees in that context is also super helpful. But still, even with that, failure still can sometimes be seen negatively. How do you talk about failure even within your own team? And is there like a story that you would share, a failure that led to some sort of significant learning or opportunity or successful outcome for an individual, for you, for the team, for the organization?
Yeah, I think failure is a very good teacher. One of the things that we've tried to do within our teams historically here at Chatham is create opportunities for small failures, not catastrophic. So giving people enough rope that they can actually learn and develop, take on the next set of tasks or take on the next set of advising, like making sure that we're using bite-sized chunks. And if they do get caught up, being there as a backstop to rescue them if they need rescuing, but actually letting the person fail on those minor things is a really good teacher because they're very unlikely to make that same mistake again. And as they grow in their careers and the opportunities that they have to advise on bigger situations, bigger investments, bigger deals, they're a lot less likely to fail in those circumstances where it could actually be catastrophic. So I think as leaders and managers, what we try to do is set things up in a way that you can fail small and really learn from those. Know that it's okay to fail small, like that there's a team behind you to help with that, but also recognizing that you don't know everything, especially as you're coming up the knowledge curve. And you really should figure out exactly where your frontier of knowledge is, and not go beyond that. You should be testing it all the time and pushing that out, but not necessarily getting ahead of your skis. And it's our job, I think, as leaders to make sure that we're not giving people too much rope. You need to have small failures, not massive failures.
I feel that so organizations can do that and think about that. And I know this ties into some of the thinking around just engagement strategies, but there's so much lies in the role of the manager. And sometimes you could be a leader of an organization and know that that's what you support. Sometimes you know that there's managers in the organization that just, might be struggling with some of their own capabilities or whatever it might be. And they have their own challenge with supporting that fail fast because they're trying to prove something for themselves and their teams. Like, have you ever had an experience with that? Or are there ways that you've tried to support it broadly at multiple levels in a team?
Yeah, the closest example I can think of are managers that actually were failing themselves by not allowing some of that to happen. So they really thought that everything needed to be a win, that they needed to only have marks in the win category, that any losses was a blemish on their record, and they couldn't have it. So either they weren't fostering the right behaviors within their teams, or they were so hung up on their own performance as a manager and what that looks like from above, that they weren't making the necessary investments in the team. And that actually led to a bigger failure on the manager's part than it would have been had they just been a little bit more relaxed about it and had a better sense of what the culture is, and like also a better relationship with their manager so that they could kind of work through those things. So taking too much on themselves, trying to do too many things and being caught up on the wrong things ended up backfiring for them. I guess one counterpoint or one thing to be aware of as you're like setting people up to be able to fail small is you really have to have the right processes in place. You have to have the team set up to have an eye on those people that are coming up the curve, be involved in their work so that you can actually identify where they need to grow, where failures are appropriate, and making sure that they're not failing in a massive way. So that requires a lot of kind of process, organization, oversight. It can't just be a free for all, everybody failing everywhere. That doesn't work.
That doesn't bode well.
Suzy emphasized the importance of employee engagement in modern workplaces. What are innovative strategies to keep employees engaged, and how are those strategies evolving?
I think the engagement strategies are probably some that have evolved the most over the course of my career. If I think about how the organizations I worked with early in my career were, quote unquote, supporting their employees, and how people are doing it now has changed pretty dramatically. Again, part of our people strategy here, we think about our culture and experience. We're really focused on giving employees the opportunity to be their whole self at work. And I think engagement strategies that are really hitting on the mark are hitting on that whole self concept. So there's a lot of creative things that organizations are doing around work-life balance. Wellness, we've seen over the years become really significant and an expectation in terms of what that means. And that's wellness across multiple categories around what you need for your whole life, not just physical wellness, but it's physical, mental, financial, career. Mental health has become a really significant component of those engagement strategies, as well as some diversity and inclusion efforts. And I think at the end of the day, if part of what's shifted and changed the most is that organizations realize they have to be a part of the care and feeding of their employees. Long gone are the days where you just have an expectation of, long hours, drop your personal life and just stay focused here. And, a lot of people I'm sure have a lot of stories about times where that came into conflict over time as their career progressed. And at the end of the day, I think individuals just want to really believe, kind of back to that authenticity, authentically, that their organization cares for them and wants them to do well and be well, and knowing that they're going to bring, if they can, bring their best selves to work. It's the best for the individual, it's the best for the team, it's the best for the organization. So thinking of that more holistically, and as we talked about earlier, really, that's at the organizational level as well as at the manager level. Sometimes you can't help the fact that you need to work really late hours to meet a deadline, but acknowledgement from a leader or a manager that you're doing that, and an appreciation for that, and acknowledgement of what maybe you had to sacrifice to get that done. Those are the things that are important. So it's a world of big things and little things, I think, when it comes to engagement and really supporting that whole self. That concludes our first episode of Expert Conversations Unpacked. We'd like to thank you all for listening. We'd love it if you would subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube to catch up on past expert conversations and to listen to future episodes.
And we'd love to hear your feedback on the topics we've covered, the guests we've invited to be interviewed by Matt, or anything else that we can do to make your listening experience more enjoyable. Please follow the link in the show notes to provide your feedback.
See you next time.